I don't know of anybody who's been to Africa, especially the part of Africa, West Africa and Gabon and that area, who hasn't been mystified by the beauty, by the sheer scale of the world there, the size of the rivers, the depth of the forest. I know I certainly was. Among the memorable things was simply going through some of the forests that remained, many of them very old, if not pristine, close to it, and to see the chimpanzees, the bush elephants, many other species of birds, and then to go back to a city and also see these species. But they weren't in a forest, they were in a market. And hunting certainly is as old as the human race. It's not limited to Africa. It's a large part and continues to be a large part of the culture in the Americas and just about everywhere else. But the notion of going through a large market, as we did in Libreville, and finding mandrills that had been killed, parts of chimpanzees, a gorilla here or there, snakes, every possible animal was quite a sight. On one hand, it's protein. People need protein to eat, and where you don't farm it, then you go find it elsewhere. At the same time, it was startling to see this. And in retrospect, it really is a parable of the whole notion of the interconnectedness of people and the larger natural world, in good ways and in bad. We drink the water, we thrive on the sunshine, we also eat the animals, but with that has come a price. And in this case, the price was a terrible pandemic, HIV/AIDS, that didn't come from directly eating the animals, but in preparing them, in butchering them, and getting some of the body fluids on your arms. And you could see in the market many people had gashes in their arms, scars from this hazardous work of cutting up large animals. And there, in that kind of colliding world of the beautiful animals in the forest meeting the city, the need for protein, and lying about hundreds of tables, was really the beginning, by all evidence, of the terrible tragedy of HIV/AIDS. It's an interesting case of detective. Here you have a disease that in the 70s really seemed to come from absolutely nowhere. It started showing up in cities. And then gradually, through a great deal of scientific research on the genetic level, looking at what pieces made up the genetics of this, slowly it began to unravel the mystery. And simply the genetics can show its origin. But further than that, as you get into the different levels and detail of genetics, it can show very specific origins, not only in terms of place it came from, but also how it evolved over many years. And one of the interesting first clues came when people began taking samples from various bushmeat markets, and they found HIV-like viruses. And by HIV-like, it meant they were not human viruses as such, but they were simian or animal viruses, related to monkeys usually. So although the specific virus that caused the HIV/AIDS pandemic was not identified in the meat markets, the fact that you had so many of the simian or monkey equivalents of the human part of it was a real eye-opener. Because if those were then seeping into the markets with clear circumstantial evidence of how they could enter the human population through nicks in the skin and blood transfer and that sort of thing, then that was a big part of the puzzle. When they then found some captive animals, chimpanzees, infected with the simian equivalent of HIV, it then really began to localize the virus in particular animals. One of the real challenges was to figure out, okay, where in the wild did these originate? If it did come from the wild, Because once an animal is in captivity, well, you can't prove that came with that animal from the wild. It may have been picked up in captivity. And so until you went back and found out its wild origins, you couldn't say definitively, this is where the virus came from. A scientist, geneticist, one of the foremost researchers, Patrice Han, did a lot of the research with her team. And ultimately it was a technology that enabled viruses to be isolated and identified in animal feces that provided the clue. And so through an ingenious study in which hundreds of samples of feces were collected throughout the forests in Cameroon, these could be identified according to male and female animals, but also individual animals. And so they would know exactly where these came from. It wasn't simply a group anymore. It could be tagged to a specific individual because every individual is different genetically, so they had a marker. And it was through isolating those that they then were able to find the genetic origins of the HIV virus. And so, having found that, the question then became, how did it make it from those wild animals to people? And once it first made it to people, then how did it make it around the world? The really only plausible explanation for how it would move from the wild into the human population originally, probably around Kinshasa, would be through hunting these infected animals. They were then brought to some of the cities. The meat or infected, once people became infected and spread it locally, there were many waterways through which people navigated, products carried, the people carried them, and it could then easily spread. Now, maybe a component that once it was in people, it didn't spread as easily initially, but over time, it evolved to spread more. And from there, it's really quite easy to see how an animal in Cameroon brought to a market, affecting people, was the beginning of it. And one other point is that people think, well, the AIDS virus was transmitted once. They think that in many cases of different diseases that it might have come from an animal once, influenza, for example, to people. But what's fascinating and scary about HIV/AIDS is that there was not a simple single transmission event. Now, yes, the HIV/AIDS, the pandemic, can be traced to a particular virus transmitted at a certain time, but the fact is that many HIV viruses have been transmitted to people, and that's what gives the rise to the different subtypes of HIV. And each of these is related or can be traced back to a different animal. That animal obviously isn't known, but a different transmission event. And so these are almost like on a microscopic scale, a subatomic scale or microscopic, is being bombarded by kind of viral meteorites. You can imagine that we have showers of these. Now and again one hits the human population. Thankfully, it's only one, if we can say thankfully about it, that has turned into such a terrible pandemic, but the potential remains that if these transmission events continue to occur, that there could be another one that's potentially as bad. So AIDS didn't just happen, or HIV didn't just happen once, it's a done deal. There are other HIV-like viruses coming to the human population. We hope none of them turn into anything like AIDS. There are individuals who have been identified with HIV-like viruses that didn't come from the chimpanzee where others came from. They have come from different types of animals, mangabeys, for example. And so there are a number of animals out there that naturally carry these viruses. And by natural, I mean they're natural reservoirs, which is to say the animal doesn't get sick. This is the home for these viruses, and they don't make the animal sick. But once they do get transmitted to people, then people aren't a natural reservoir. They become a host and become ill from them. But yes, there are people that have been identified with different types of HIV-like viruses from different animals. Fortunately, these did not spread, and so they have not become pandemics. But the point is, it shows that HIV is one along a continuum of HIV-like viruses or simian viruses coming from monkeys or other animals that can infect people. It's just one, and it was a very bad one, obviously, a tragic one. We can hope there are not more. But it begs the question, what, or should we be doing more to see that we don't have another one cross that causes such a terrible catastrophe? Yep. It's fascinating. Almost every new and emerging disease, Lyme disease, HIV/AIDS, hantavirus, West Nile virus, antibiotic resistance, all of these diseases, almost all of them, come from animals. And the question, well, why is it that they're coming now? Part of the question is that the boundaries between people and animals, the natural boundaries that existed, are being destroyed, and we become part of the food chain that wasn't there before for these microorganisms, for these viruses. Certainly that seems to be the case. Now, yes, Africa had the stereotype as a dark continent. Well, all these things must come from Africa. Of course, that's a myth, that they come from all over the world. Two of them, a major one comes from Africa, HIV. West Nile virus, sure, ultimately began as the virus originally was, but we have influenzas coming from China, and perhaps the worst influenza of all, Spanish influenza, despite it being called Spanish influenza, probably coming from the Midwest in the United States. So we have just diseases coming from all parts of the world. That Africa is really no exception to any of this. As people move further into the forest, that they begin to kind of cross some of the natural boundaries we step into a food chain of which we were never a part. And Ebola, I think, is an example of which is one more example of this. And if I could take it one step further, it's probably not surprising that many of the new diseases are agriculturally related. It's because as people, more people need more food to survive. Let's take the example of mad cow, and I think it's important to bring these up because really HIV/AIDS exists within I call them ecodemics, because they really share similar origins, and that it's something about changes in the way people have dealt with the environment that has brought these about. We're not innocent victims, we're often co-conspirators in the emergence of disease, many rooted in agriculture. Certainly mad cow, after World War II, the attempt to create save energy. People took what used to be the bad parts of animals and throw them out, the bones and parts that weren't edible. Well, they began to render them and make them into pellets that they then fed back to animals. They turned these herbivores into omnivores, or in some cases carnivores. And that was the origin of mad cow. That is a disease in sheep that emerged. Influenza likely comes from the mixture of ducks, duck farms, of rice paddies, where it attracts wild ducks that were the natural carriers of influenza. Those intermingle with pigs, which become a vessel, a laboratory where it evolves and acclimates itself to humans, because pigs and humans are remarkably similar in the structure of their trachea and the part of the body where the flu takes root. And so many of these come back to a shared moral, a common story, that people have done something, obviously not intentionally, that has put them in the way of entirely new diseases. And that is really the story of HIV in some ways, and many of the other similar diseases, at least an origin of which HIV is a part. So what? Good. So what? We know where a disease begins. So what? I think that is important for a few reasons. number one, in terms of medically speaking, to know where something began, to know where the evolutionary history of this, the genetics, which may be 10 years, 20 years, maybe 100 years, really helps us to prevent it in the future, because we can see the record of evolution, where it occurred, how it occurred, and so that is certainly a way of helping to prevent things in the future. So it's absolutely critical, the historical understanding of where these come from. I think on a deeper level, it's a historical understanding that empowers people, because then they can see that they are not victims of disease. Did we not have some idea of the history of many of these diseases that I've mentioned here, we might and probably would still believe, well, we're just human victims of nature. It's not that way, and so I think that the understanding of the history has really brought a perspective. It's an empowering perspective, because it shows us that, wait, we had a hand in these historically, maybe we can turn back the tide in some cases, or we can prevent it in future cases. So the history is not just a footnote, the history is the essence of prevention and understanding, I think.